Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At my mother's birthday brunch, while the server was still setting down the coffee and the last round of syrupy compliments was circling the table like a tired carousel that never stops because everyone is waiting for someone else to get off first, my mother laughed, leaned just enough to be heard by the people who had come to watch her be adored, and said I would never have the charm my sister has, and it landed so cleanly that for a second I thought the room had agreed to breathe in at the same time, and I smiled because I have trained myself to smile when she does that, and I reached for the plates because it is easier to look useful than to look hurt, and I stacked them and walked them to the kitchen like I worked there. Which I basically do when it comes to this family, because I am the one who keeps everything moving without making a show of it, and I am the one who pays attention to the things no one else wants to see. I didn't make a speech, I didn't cry, I didn't ask why she needed the laugh at my expense in front of cousins who measure their holidays by how many times my mother praises my sister's latest win. And I didn't remind anyone that I am the one who booked the reservation and paid the deposit and negotiated the cake price, because my mother likes a certain kind of attention that never looks cheap. And I am the one who sends the calendar reminders and keeps the family group chat from turning into a blame museum every time someone forgets an anniversary, and I didn't say any of that because I learned a long time ago that explanations are just invitations for new rules, so I cleared the plates, I thanked the staff. And I let my mother be the queen she has always asked us to recognize by clapping at the right moments and pretending the crown is not plastic. My sister, who has never met a spotlight she didn't call by its first name, tilted her head like she was offering me pity for not knowing how to shine, and I could feel the old muscle memory kick in, the one that used to make me rush to be the reasonable one. The peacemaker, the daughter who doesn't rock the boat because someone has to steer it, and then something calm and extremely steady happened in my chest, as if a very quiet door finally closed from the inside, and I realized I didn't have to race them to the story they wanted, because I had my own, and it didn't need a witness to be true. So I kept working, soft voice, small nods, no reaction, and if you think that is weakness, you have never seen what a still surface can do to a person who needs ripples to prove they are alive. And I let my mother enjoy her throne while a few polite guests pretended not to notice that the toast she made in my sister's honor had more adjectives than the one she made for her own birthday. And when it was time for goodbyes and air kisses, and those promises that evaporate before the parking lot, I hugged her and said I loved her because I do, even when I don't like her at all, and I walked out without offering to pack the leftovers, which is a small thing unless you have always been the person who remembers the small things, in which case it is the kind of decision that changes a story. Back home, I turned my phone face down on the counter, made tea I didn't really want, and sat at the table where I have paid bills and drafted budgets and balanced things that were never mine to carry, and I opened our old messages. Those short little texts where my mother forwarded posts about how brilliant my sister's side venture was, and how proud she felt and how grateful she was to have a daughter who brought sparkle to every room, and I scrolled past the ones where I was asked to pick up favors or check in on a vendor or confirm a call because my sister was too busy being charming, and I did something I have never done before, which is nothing, and it felt strange at first, like forgetting a password you used every day. And then it felt like finally remembering your own name. The call started within the hour, my mother at first sounding triumphant because the party had been lovely and she wanted to relive it, and then, when I didn't answer, moving into that careful tone she uses when she is not sure whether to be sweet or sharp. And my sister's name popping up with the kind of confidence that assumes I will pick up because I always have, and I let them ring, and I watched the phone vibrate a trail across the table, and I let it, and I told myself this was not silence for punishment's sake, this was silence for clarity, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person who thinks they are entitled to you is let them find out what you actually do for them when you stop doing it. Then I opened the little folder on my laptop where I keep the passwords, the calendars, the contact sheets, the templates for emails my mother sends to her charity board, the reminders for renewal dates that she never remembers and my sister never even knows exist, and I removed my admin role on everything I had set up to make their lives seamless. And I did it legally and cleanly and with notes that explained how the primary owner could take full control, and I logged each change in a document. with clear steps because I am not cruel, I am thorough, and I am also done. And when it came to the shared family cloud where I have been the quiet archivist, I switched the settings so everyone had to manage their own space. And that tiny click felt like taking back a room in a house I bought but never got to decorate. You could call that petty, but I call it fair, and I also call it the first time I put a boundary in writing rather than in a late-night promise to myself that dissolved the minute someone needed a favor. And before I went to bed, I set a single rule in my head, which was that I would not explain any of it unless someone asked a real question in good faith, because I am not a hotline for people who treat me like a convenience, and I slept better than I have in a long time, not because anything was solved, but because I wasn't volunteering to be the solution anymore. In the morning, before my alarm could make me regret the new day, my phone lit up with a message from my sister, short and very unlike her usual victory lap texts, just a plain line that said our mother was shaken and kept asking for me. And I looked at those words and sat very still, because for the first time in my life it felt like the balance had shifted, and not by accident. When I read my sister's message saying our mother was shaken and kept asking for me, I sat there longer than made sense for a simple text, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it perfectly. Since in our family the performance always starts with a little tremor designed to pull the responsible person back into position, and for years that person has been me. Which is why the choice I made that morning was not about punishing anyone or proving anything but about refusing to jump when the string got tugged, and I put the phone down face first and let the day begin without me as their on-call fixer, which felt reckless and steady at the same time. Like finally taking your hands off a cart you never wanted to push, but kept moving because everyone else kept piling their stuff on top. Silence is not natural for me. At least not the kind that holds, because my reflex is to smooth and translate and anticipate, and I have always been good at it, which is exactly why my mother leans into the easy line about my sister's charm. Since it costs nothing to praise sparkle when someone else is sweeping up the glitter later, so I made coffee, opened my laptop, and instead of drafting the apology text that would make life simpler for everyone but me, I opened a different set of tabs, the ones that show the parts of our lives that run because I set them in motion, and I watched them sit there without my name on them anymore, and I let that be a little uncomfortable. Because growth often looks exactly like not rescuing people who think you live for the rescue. I checked my sister's business pages, the ones my mother forwards around like a proud publicist, and if you look past the curated posts and the breathless captions, you can see the comments that slip through at odd hours. The ones about delayed orders and unanswered emails and refund requests that sit for weeks, and you can see the timestamps where an apology used to arrive and doesn't anymore. And I recognize the pattern because that gap is where I used to step in after a late-night call that began with my sister saying she had it handled and ended with me writing the response and setting the calendar reminder and doing the pricing spreadsheet, and I realized that the absence of my behind-the-scenes work was not cruel, it was simply accurate, and accuracy has a way of clarifying reputations. Before you think I was hunting for dirt, understand that I wasn't digging for a scandal, I was inventorying reality, which is what I do best, so I pulled a small bundle of things I had every right to keep. Namely the templates and checklists I built for my mother's charity board, and I read through their vendor policy the way I would for any organization where people care about both outcomes and optics, and I saw, as I have seen for years, that it lives in that space where good intentions meet. Poor boundaries, which is how my sister ended up as a preferred vendor without anyone wanting to write down the plain language of that choice. And as I read the policy, I felt the old sting of being told to stay out of grown-up conversations when what they meant was keep doing the unglamorous work while other people make the public decisions. So I did something that felt both boring and radical, which is the exact combination that tends to change things. I wrote a short, courteous email to the charity's secretary and the treasurer, not dramatic, not accusatory, just practical, where I said I was stepping back from volunteer coordination for personal reasons and that, before I went, I wanted to make sure the compliance calendar and the vendor files were tight, and I attached a clear, neutral checklist any board could love, with a simple conflict of interest disclosure form and a reminder that when a board member or an immediate family member is A vendor, the file needs a competitive quote comparison and a signed recusal note, not to create problems, but to keep good programs protected from noise. And I added a line offering to walk the new point person through the files for 30 minutes on Zoom if they needed it. Then I hit send. And as it left my outbox, I felt the strange relief of turning on a light in a room everyone claimed was bright already. If you think that was a strike at my mother or a cheap shot at my sister, you're missing it, because my goal was not to burn down anything. My goal was to stop carrying the risk for choices I didn't make, and to return responsibility to the people who insist on owning the microphone, and that means writing down what should have been written down years ago and letting systems do what they do when no one is cushioning the impact with quiet labor. And yes, of course I knew exactly how that email would land, not because it accused anyone of anything, but because a request for routine documentation is the loudest question in any room that runs on trust me. Then I made a second move that looked even smaller, which is often how you get the best results, and I forwarded a set of perfectly public links, reviews, timestamped pages, screenshots that any customer could pull, to one person who loves to talk but never lies, an old family friend who has spent decades in donor circles and who genuinely believes that transparency keeps good causes from becoming messy headlines. And I asked her, with the same politeness I use when I am booking flowers, whether she would be willing to share a general note at the next luncheon about why recusal and vendor documentation are not personal, they are protective, and I left it at that. No names, no finger pointing. Just the kind of nudge that makes people look at the file they have ignored. By late afternoon, the replies started rolling in with that overly formal tone people use when they are trying to figure out who is holding the match. The treasurer thanking me for my service and asking for a copy of the vendor list with start dates. The secretary scheduling a governance review for the end of the week, and a separate message from that talkative friend saying she was so glad I had raised the point because, as it happened, a couple of board members had been confused about a recent contract and would appreciate some clarity before the annual report went out. And while none of those words said my sister's name, every single one of them pointed straight at the arrangement my mother has always called convenient, and I have always called risky. I ignored the string of texts from my sister that grew more clipped as the afternoon turned into evening, because I could feel her trying out versions of control, starting with sweet, moving to casual, then shifting into that sharp tone she uses when she forgets she needs me more than I need her. And I answered none of them, not out of spite, but because I had already spoken in the only language that gets heard in our world, the language of policy and timing and consequence. And just before I closed my laptop, I saw a new calendar invite appear from the charity's governance committee with a subject line that read conflict review, and the guest list did not include me, which for once felt exactly right. And as I reached to turn off the screen, my phone lit up with a new message from my sister that was not a performance at all, just one unvarnished line that said, "What did you do? Because Mom is panicking." Which is when I understood that quiet can be the loudest thing in the room when you stop using it to keep other people comfortable. By the time my sister's third message landed with that clipped edge that always shows up when charm stops working and pressure takes its place, I had already decided that I was not going to meet her in the usual arena where I explain, she denies, I soothe, and then we pretend progress happened, because I was tired of being the mechanic for a machine that was designed to grind me down. So I opened the files I keep for my own work, the drafts and product shots and copy blocks I wrote on quiet nights when she said she needed a push for a launch, and I, the helpful one, sent finished paragraphs and high-resolution images with my watermark tucked in a corner, and I took a very calm inventory of where my words and my photos had ended up without my name, my permission, or my boundaries, and the answer, as expected, was almost everywhere that mattered to her brand. There are rules for this, the boring kind that makers and freelancers know by heart, and that charismatic people like my sister pretend are optional. So I followed the rules with a politeness that would hold up in court and in a church basement, sending simple takedown requests to hosting providers and platforms where my images and text had been reposted under her logo, each one short and factual with dates and links and source files, not vindictive, not theatrical, just the slow turning of a Well, that was always there, but that I had refused to touch because I knew exactly how much noise it would make once it moved. And then I sent one more message, the one that felt like the first time I put my own name at the top of the page. A formal note to her business email stating that any further use of my assets would require a written license and a fee schedule, which is not dramatic or cruel or even unkind. It is simply how grown people treat each other when they are done using love as a free resource. While those requests were making their way through systems that do not care who is the golden child at a birthday brunch, I did something else that looked small until you understand how our world works, and I wrote a plain, friendly guide to getting a refund when a small business falls behind, the kind of step-by-step that helps customers avoid shouting into the void, with sample language that is firm and civil, and that cites the policies publicly posted on my sister's site. And I shared it in a neighborhood group where women swap recommendations and warnings, and where my sister's ads have lived rent-free for years because my mother made sure every friend of a friend heard the pitch, and I did not mention my sister's name. I did not throw shade. I simply gave people the tools to speak a language that payment processors and customer service teams recognize, and then I put my phone down and let natural consequences do the part one have always interrupted. It took the platforms less than a day to remove the images I had flagged and to tag the posts with the standard notice about intellectual property, which meant that a few of my sister's best-performing ads went dark without warning, which meant her inbound slowed at exactly the moment when her backlog was starting to scream, and because timing is not a moral issue, but it is absolutely a strategic one, the guide I had shared began to circulate in the local groups that feed her customer base, and requests that had been ignored suddenly arrived with the right subject lines and the right references, which means that the payment processor that had been letting things slide without escalating now had a neat little stack of polite, verifiable complaints. And if you have ever worked a real job, you know what happens next, because systems like patterns more than they like personalities. My mother called in the early evening with the voice she uses when she wants to sound reasonable, but is building a runway for a guilt trip, and she said people were saying confusing things online, and did I have any idea what could be causing it? Because she was worried about my sister's reputation and the charity's event calendar and the family name, and I listened without cutting in, then told her that documentation is not an attack, it is a seatbelt, and that if she was so certain everything was above board, then she should be grateful someone finally wrote down the steps that keep good intentions from becoming a mess, and she tried to pivot into the greatest hits about loyalty and family and how outsiders twist narratives. But I did not step into that dance. I just repeated that she should let the process run, and when she said I was being cold, I told her I was being clear, which is something she is not used to hearing from me. My sister, on the other hand, skipped the pretense and went straight for the jugular in a public post that looked like a victory speech written during a panic attack, a long rant about jealous people and trolls, and how some folks love to tear down what they cannot build, which would have been impressive if it had not been followed by a handful of customers who, in the comments, described their delayed orders and pointed to the very refund policy she had written, and then one of them used the exact language from the guide I had shared, which told me the message had landed exactly where it needed to, and a few hours later the post vanished without a trace, not edited, not softened, just gone, and I did not need anyone to tell me why. Because somewhere between the takedowns and the processor alerts and the board's new agenda item, the story had stopped being about my feelings and started being about her paper trail, which has never been her favorite genre. When the rant disappeared, my phone buzzed with a single line from a mutual friend who sits on 2 donor committees and 1 gossip throne, asking whether I was planning to attend a certain charity gala my mother never invites me to because I make the room less sparkly, and before I could answer, another message came in from the governance committee chair, this one formal and sober and copied to my mother, inviting me, in my capacity as the person who built the compliance calendar, to attend a brief pre-gala review to answer a few procedural questions, which is when I realized that my absence had finally created a vacuum visible to people who are not paid to see. And as I stared at the invite, the screen lit again with my sister's name and the question every bully asks when the rules start working, a plain "what did you do" followed by a please, which is a word I have waited my entire life to hear from her. And not because I need it, but because it means the ground has finally moved. The governance chair's email landed with that flat tone you get when people have decided to treat something as real whether or not the personalities in the room are ready, and I read it twice before replying, because I wanted my yes to be clean and unhurried. And I wrote that I would be glad to answer procedural questions regarding the calendar and vendor files, and that I could attend a short meeting before the gala, and then I closed my laptop and let the decision sit in the air the way you let bread rise without poking it, because I have learned that restraint is not silence, it is pressure applied in a way that leaves fingerprints where they count, and I knew exactly how my mother would hear about the meeting, not because I would tell her, but because in our world the grapevine carries governance news faster than it carries fire. When I arrived at the pre-gala review, the small conference room felt like every volunteer space I have ever propped up with polite reminders and color-coded timelines, nothing fancy. Just people with too many responsibilities and too few systems. And I answered what they asked with the kind of simple clarity that sticks, explaining that it was standard to maintain a current vendor list with start dates and a conflict disclosure signed by any board member whose immediate family had a financial relationship with the organization, and that a competitive quote comparison is not an accusation but a record of prudence, and that recusal language protects good intentions from looking like favoritism on paper. And I watched the treasurer's shoulders drop in that way people do when they realize the solution is paperwork and not a war, and I could feel the room shift from defensive to practical, which is my favorite shift because it is the only one that lasts. They asked, carefully, whether my sister's business had provided such documentation at the start of the relationship, and I said, equally carefully, that I had never seen it in the file and that it would be wise to request it now before the annual audit cycle, preferably with updated terms that clarify refund protocols and delivery windows. And I suggested a pause on new contracts until the file was complete, not because I wanted to embarrass anyone, but because a pause is the kind of grown-up decision that saves an organization from cleaning up a much bigger mess later, and the chair nodded in that measured way that tells you the decision is already made. And the secretary asked me to draft the exact request language so they could send it before the gala began, and I did, on the spot, short and polite and impossible to misread. I walked down the hall toward the ballroom not thinking about the decor or the guest list or any of the window dressing people like to brag about after these nights, because I was listening for my phone, which I had set to vibrate only for messages from 3 people: the governance chair, the treasurer, and one other name I had added that morning, a name that does not appear on any donor list and does not show up in my mother's contacts because she has spent years pretending that certain parts of my sister's past were a misunderstanding that kind people do not bring up, and that name belonged to a former colleague of my sister's from the company she left abruptly years ago. A colleague who had once called me after a long day to ask whether I knew that my writing and my spreadsheets were showing up inside my sister's internal project decks without my name, and whether I also knew that an internal review had found some things my mother would not want to hear, and I had thanked her and kept the information the way you keep a spare key you never talk about until the lock jams and you need to get inside without breaking a window. My mother stopped me just past the coat check with the kind of smile that tells you the photo is more important than the person, and she asked whether I was there to cause trouble or to show support, and I told her I was there to answer questions and enjoy the program, both of which were true, and she said the committee had overreacted because some people in positions they did not earn love to swing clipboards around like power, and I reminded her that the committee chair was her pick and that I had volunteered a fraction of my life to make sure her events looked as seamless as she wanted the world to believe they were, and she shifted to the tender tone that she keeps for big moments, asking whether I was really going to stand by while strangers questioned my sister's integrity, and that is when I told her that strangers were not the problem, the file was the problem. And the fastest way to end the questions was to answer them with documents instead of emotion, and as I said it, my phone buzzed once in that distinct pattern I had set for the chair, and I excused myself, because I am done having conversations where my practicality is treated like betrayal. The message was short, a thank you for the draft, and a note that the request had gone out to all vendors with family connections, which is how you keep a process from looking like a witch hunt. and a reminder that a temporary hold on new contracts would start immediately until the files were complete, and I stood there absorbing the relief that happens when you stop trying to protect everybody from accountability. And then the phone buzzed again with a new name, the former colleague, confirming. She had arrived, that she had taken a seat toward the front like I requested, and that she had brought, as promised, a simple letter signed years ago that no one had ever asked to see. A short summary from her company's counsel stating that my sister's exit had included an agreement not to represent certain projects as solely hers and not to reuse internal materials in future ventures without license, which is not scandal. It is just history, and history has weight when truth is the question. I moved through the room with the kind of steady mind that comes when you finally act like your own advocate. Chatting with people who have known me since I was the kid who took the class attendance when the teacher ran late and who still expect me to be the adult in the room when things get weird. And I let conversations be light and ordinary because nothing attracts attention like trying to look invisible, and I waited for the moment when my mother would realize that this night, which has always been her victory lap, had turned into an audit of the roles we all play. And I saw the flicker land in her eyes when the MC announced a brief statement from the governance chair about refreshed compliance standards and new documentation timelines for all vendors. And then I caught the smallest movement at the edge of the floor as my sister rushed toward the committee table with her smile turned too bright and her voice just a little too loud. She pulled me aside with that urgent affection that feels like a hand on the back of your neck, demanding to know whether I had engineered this, and I told her that processes do not need engineers when the structure already exists, they need space. And that I had finally decided to stop filling that space with my free labor, and she said I was jealous and dramatic and cruel, and I said I was tired of being quiet about work I did for free while being mocked for not being interesting enough to talk about. And while we stood there pretending to be two sisters having a normal chat near a silent auction table, the MC introduced a guest who had come to speak briefly about ethical vendor practices and protecting creative work, a polite, tan woman with a clear voice who had shared a desk pod with my sister years ago, and I watched my mother's face freeze into that elegant expression she uses when she wants to look unbothered for photographs with donors, and I could feel the room tilt by a degree as the woman thanked the organization for valuing transparency and then said she was happy to see old friends in the room tonight, which is when my phone lit with one more buzz from the governance chair, a single line that read, "We may need you to clarify one point on record after her remarks. Can you be ready?" And I slipped the phone into my bag and told my sister I needed a glass of water, while inside I counted the beats toward the moment I had been saving for years. When the former colleague finished her short remarks about ethical vendor practices, making a point that protecting creative work is not about punishing entrepreneurs, but about keeping trust steady so donors do not have to do detective work with every invoice, the chair gave me the smallest nod, and I stepped forward with that steady voice I use when I want facts to do the heavy lifting, thanking her for coming and, because there was no point pretending we were strangers, thanking her for the letter she had sent me years ago, the one that clarified that my sister's exit from her old company came with an agreement not to present certain projects as solely hers and not to reuse internal materials without a license. And I said it plainly and calmly, then turned to the chair and added that our organization could model best practice by acknowledging that lessons learned in one chapter can protect everyone in the next, which is a gentle way of saying the history matters even if a few people in the room would prefer not to read it aloud. I did not say my sister's name because policies do not require names, they require steps, but names have a way of presenting themselves when steps land in the right order. And I watched the logic ripple through the donors and vendors and committee members who have spent years nodding along to my mother's speeches. And you could feel the small recalibration that happens when a group realizes that the adult in the room has been the quiet one all along, the one who keeps the calendar and the receipts and the words that nobody claps for, and when the chair asked, on the record, whether the vendor files contained the necessary disclosures and competitive quotes, I said I could only speak to what I had seen, which was nothing of the kind, and that a pause on related contracts would save the board from the headache of cleaning it up later, which drew a few murmurs from people who understand that prevention is not dramatic, but it is unforgettable when you watch it work. My mother tried to pivot into charm with a little comment about how families should not be put on trial at a fundraiser, and she asked the room to remember that creativity comes with messy edges, and I answered, still in that same measured tone, that creativity does not excuse failing to put a signature where it belongs, and that the board's job is not to protect anyone's feelings, it is to protect the mission and the money entrusted to it, and I swear I watched 20 years of my own unpaid labor float up between us like a ledger finally read aloud, not because I was angry in that moment, although I had every reason to be, but because speaking plainly has a way of cutting the oxygen to drama, leaving only the actions that either hold up or collapse. And my sister, who had been hovering at the edge of the committee table, stepped forward with a bright smile that did not match her eyes and said she would be happy to supply whatever the board needed, which would have been impressive if her voice had not wavered on the word supply, as if it had never had to carry real weight. The chair thanked everyone and moved the program along because a gala needs to stay on schedule even when the center of gravity shifts. And I let the event wash over me in the way you do when a long project finally lands and you realize that the victory was never going to arrive with trumpets. It was always going to look like a series of quiet decisions that made a loud situation behave. And while donors clinked glasses and the MC tried to bring the room back to cheerful, my phone buzzed with a note from the treasurer confirming that a hold on new vendor payments had been logged until files were complete, and a second buzz from the governance chair with a thank you and a promise that the policy update would be voted in before the week was out. And then one more from the former colleague, a simple line saying that truth does not need to be cruel to be clear, which is the sentence I wish someone had told me when I was a teenager carrying the emotional trash bags no one wanted to claim. I stood by the doorway where people exit for air and goodbyes, and my mother approached with that brittle smile she uses when she is trying to decide whether to scold or recruit. And she said I had humiliated the family and that donors would gossip and that I could have handled this quietly, and I told her I had handled it as quietly as possible for as long as possible. That the only reason we were speaking this plainly in public now was because the private route had been exhausted by years of me fixing and absorbing and erasing, and that the board's timeline and the processor's notices and the takedowns and the refund requests had all arrived at the same conclusion she had been refusing to reach, which is that loving someone and covering for them are not the same job, and I am no longer taking the second job without a paycheck or gratitude. She opened her mouth to say something about loyalty, but my sister got there first, asking whether I felt proud of myself now that I had ruined her biggest night, and I told her I did not ruin anything. I simply stopped lying to protect her from ordinary systems, and I added, with the smallest smile I allowed myself all evening, that everything I had asked for was standard, and that she could clear it all by submitting 3 simple things she should have had from the start: a disclosure, a quote, comparison, and a license. And I asked, gently, whether she had those ready, and she looked at our mother with a flicker that said out loud what she could not, which is that she had always believed she would never be asked for them because a certain kind of confidence had taught her that rules were optional if you were interesting enough at brunch. I left before the closing toast because I wanted the night to end on my terms, and when I got home I did not pour anything dramatic or stage a victory speech to an empty room. I sat at the same table where I used to solve everybody's emergencies, and I let the stillness tell me what it always tries to say when you stop drowning it out, and as I was about to put the phone on silent for the night, the message arrived from my sister. Shaped like a surrender she was not ready to name, a line saying, "Our mother was shaken and kept asking for me," and I looked at that sentence and understood that it did not land in the past, but in the present, and that the fear in it was not about compliance or vendors or donors. It was about the moment when a parent realizes the child who always forgave has decided to grow up without an audience. I typed my reply slowly because I wanted every word to be something I would stand by if read out loud to people who do not love me, telling her that our mother knew exactly how to reach me and that I would meet her anywhere she wanted if she was ready to have a real conversation with real terms, not a performance, not a rerun. And I added that I would gladly help her assemble the documents the board requested if she wanted to treat me like a professional instead of a prop, and I hit send, then turned the phone face down, not as a threat or a flourish, but as the quiet last move in a plan I had been building since the first time I was told to be useful and invisible at the same time, and I sat there in the calm that follows a clean line. Knowing I had not burned down a house, I had turned on all the lights, and if some people hated the glare, that was never my fault to carry.